The screen is a blur of sand and smoke, a maelstrom of grit and chaos. The deafening roar of wind and gunfire is an overwhelming physical force, pressing in from all sides. A heavy, inert rifle is thrust into the hands of a terrified-looking woman in clean fatigues, her eyes wide with a fear that seems too pure for this hellish landscape. The voice of a desperate soldier, raw and cracking, yells, "It's jammed! Do something!" The woman, Lara Briggs, looks at the useless weapon, a 20-pound paperweight, then towards an unseen enemy ridgeline. Her expression, once a mask of pure terror, shifts into something else entirely, an unnerving, intense focus that seems to burn away the panic. They were pinned down, blind, and seconds from being overrun. In the heart of the storm, their most powerful weapon was nothing more than dead weight. They handed it to a supply clerk who had never been in a firefight, a woman they thought was just there to count boxes. They expected nothing. What she did next, however, would not only save their lives, it would defy the laws of possibility. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The air in Staff Sergeant Lara Briggs's supply depot at Forward Operating Base Phoenix smelled of cardboard, plastic wrap, and the faint, sterile scent of new electronics. It was a world of quiet, meticulous order. Metal shelves stretched towards the high ceiling, each one perfectly organized, their contents labeled with military precision, every box and crate aligned as if measured with a laser. Lara was at her desk, a small island of command in her sea of inventory. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, her eyes scanning digital manifests, auditing the ceaseless flow of material that kept the war machine running. Her workspace was a sanctuary of logic, a fortress of predictability built against the violent uncertainty that churned just beyond the base's perimeter walls. Sergeant Petrov, a burly, grizzled quartermaster with hands permanently stained by grease and grit, leaned his considerable bulk against her doorframe. He was a creature of the motor pool, a man who understood the world through the tangible feel of a wrench on a bolt, and he regarded Lara's digital domain with a familiar, weary scorn. "Still counting beans, Briggs?" he grunted, his voice a low rumble. "Make sure you don't get a paper cut. It's a war zone out there." And it would be a much more difficult war zone to fight in if Alpha Company didn't have the ammunition I just sourced for them, Sergeant, Lara replied without looking up from her screen. Her tone was flat, devoid of emotion, a simple statement of fact. "Your requisition was approved. It's on pallet 7, waiting for your crew." Petrov grumbled something under his breath as he pushed himself off the doorframe and lumbered away. The words, though muffled, carried clearly back to her. Desk jockeys. Wouldn't last 5 minutes outside the wire. Lara's shoulders tightened, a barely perceptible clench of muscle. She was defined by her job, a role she excelled at with a quiet, obsessive passion. She was the master of a complex, high-stakes puzzle, ensuring the right gear got to the right people at the right time. A single misplaced decimal point in her world could mean a platoon went into a fight without enough bullets or blood plasma. She knew her worth, but she was also acutely aware of how the combat soldiers, the door kickers, perceived her, a necessary but lesser part of the whole. She found her comfort in the clean lines of a spreadsheet, the absolute certainty of a balanced ledger, a stark and welcome contrast to the bloody, chaotic math of the battlefield. Now, she was in the back of an MRAP, and her body was a single, rigid knot of tension. This was her first time on a convoy, her first time outside the wire. The vehicle's interior was a cramped, claustrophobic space that smelled of diesel, sweat, and the faint, metallic tang of fear, which she suspected was mostly her own. Outside the thick, bulletproof windows, the landscape was a monotonous, sun-bleached expanse of desert, a vast and empty canvas that seemed to swallow the light. The soldiers from Alpha Company packed in around her were a study in practiced relaxation. Their banter was easy and familiar, a constant stream of inside jokes and casual insults that flowed as naturally as breathing. They were a tribe, and Lara, with her clean uniform and pale face, was an intruder. She clutched the tablet containing her inventory audit files to her chest, her knuckles white. It was her shield, a piece of her orderly world in this rumbling metal box hurtling through chaos. Lieutenant Reyes, the platoon leader, a young man with old eyes, caught her gaze and gave her a reassuring nod. "Just a routine run, Staff Sergeant," he said, his voice calm and steady over the engine's roar. "We'll have you at the outpost by lunch." Lara forced a tight, brittle smile in return. Her stomach was a churning pit of anxiety, and the breakfast she'd forced down hours ago felt like a lead weight in her gut. She wanted to believe him, wanted to believe this was just a commute, but the casual way the soldiers held their rifles and the constant, sweeping scan of their eyes told a different story. The world exploded, A deafening, gut-punching roar ripped through the air, and the lead vehicle in their convoy vanished in a roiling fireball of black smoke and orange flame. The MRAP Lara was in swerved violently, the tires screaming as the driver fought for control. For a terrifying second, the world became a tumbling, weightless vortex of metal, dust, and the disembodied screams of the men around her. The vehicle slammed onto its side with a bone-jarring crash that threw her against the wall, and then there was only darkness and the high, piercing whine of a ringing in her ears. The ringing was absolute, a solid wall of sound that blocked out everything else. The air, thick and choking, tasted of acrid explosives and burning fuel. Disoriented and bruised, Lara struggled to make sense of her surroundings. Her vision was a blurry, swimming mess, obscured by the thick dust that filled the cabin. She scrambled out through a hatch, tumbling onto the hot sand, and found herself behind the wreckage of the MRAP. It was the only cover available. Bullets began to ping and ricochet off the thick metal frame, each impact a sharp, deadly counterpoint to the dull roar in her head. A sandstorm was kicking up, the wind a malevolent force that whipped stinging grains of sand into her face, reducing visibility with each passing second. High, on a distant ridge, almost invisible through the growing haze, tiny muzzle flashes blinked like angry stars, a sniper and a machine gunner, well entrenched and hunting them at their leisure. Corporal Jensen, the platoon's sniper, was screaming. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated frustration, his face a mask of red rage and rising panic. He was crouched behind the MRAP's massive engine block, wrestling with his rifle. "It's jammed," he bellowed, his voice hoarse. "The bolt's seized. This piece of junk is going to get us all killed." His spotter, Corporal Davies, was beside him, his own expression grim. "Calm down, let me see." He grabbed the rifle and tried to work the action, pulling on the charging handle with all his strength, but it wouldn't budge. It was locked up tight. An enemy round, impossibly accurate, struck the metal just above their heads. It ricocheted downwards, and a spray of hot shrapnel tore through the air. Davies cried out, a sharp, pained gasp, and instinctively clutched his arm, blood welling between his fingers. His eyes, wide with shock and pain, scanned the limited cover. He saw Lara huddled nearby, her face pale and streaked with dirt, but otherwise unharmed. In a moment of pure, unthinking desperation, he crawled the few feet to her, shoving the heavy 20-pound M2010 sniper rifle into her lap. The weapon landed with a solid, dead weight. "You, clerk! See if you can fix this!" he yelled over the rising howl of the wind, his voice strained. He didn't wait for an answer, already scrambling back to the relative safety of the engine block to tend to his wound, leaving Lara alone with the broken gun. She stared down at it. The rifle felt alien in her hands, a complex and menacing object of cold steel and polymer. It was heavy, impossibly so. The chaotic symphony of the battle, the pinging bullets, the screaming wind, the distant shouts of the soldiers, all of it began to fade into a dull, background roar. Her world narrowed, shrinking until it contained only her and the cold, complex piece of machinery in her hands. The weapon was broken, the situation was hopeless, and everyone was looking at her as her fingers, no longer trembling, traced the cold, familiar contours of the rifle's stock and receiver. The battlefield dissolved. The howl of the wind and the crack of incoming fire faded into a distant hum, replaced by a scent she hadn't truly smelled in years. The holy trinity of her childhood, gun oil, wood shavings, and hot metal filings. She was no longer a staff sergeant huddled in the dirt of a foreign desert. She was a little girl again, standing on a worn wooden stool in a dusty, cluttered workshop. The room was a chaotic cathedral dedicated to a single, demanding god, ballistic perfection. Sunlight, thick with dancing dust motes, streamed through a high, grimy window, illuminating the lathe in the corner, the drill press standing like a silent sentinel, and the long workbench that was her father's altar. Her father, Mark Briggs, a tall, quiet man with eyes the color of a stormy sky, stood behind her. His large, calloused hands, surprisingly gentle, rested over her own small ones, guiding them as they worked the bolt of a custom rifle. She remembered his voice, a low, patient rumble that seemed to vibrate in her very bones, a sound more comforting than any lullaby. "Every rifle has a soul, Lara," he would say, his breath smelling of coffee and metal, a rhythm, a story etched into its steel. You don't force it, you don't fight it. You listen to it, you feel its pulse, you understand its language. She could feel it now, the memory of the satisfying, solid click of a perfectly seated magazine, the smooth, buttery travel of a well-oiled bolt sliding into battery. For her father, And by extension for her, this was never about violence. It was about physics. It was about the elegant, undeniable truth of a perfectly executed mechanical process. It was about the pursuit of an impossible standard, a single, flawless moment where man and machine became one. It was their shared language, a silent communion in a world that often felt loud and confusing. Lara blinked, and the dusty workshop vanished. The desert, the wrecked MRAP, and the stinging sand slammed back into her senses. But something fundamental had shifted inside her. The fear, the icy, paralyzing terror that had gripped her just moments before, was gone. In its place was a cold, clear, and intense analytical focus. Her hands, which had been shaking uncontrollably, were now as steady as a surgeon's. The M2010 in her lap was no longer an alien object of menace. It was a problem to be solved, a familiar puzzle waiting for its master. The soldiers nearby, including a stunned Lieutenant Reyes, who had crawled closer to check on her, watched as her entire demeanor transformed. She was no longer the pale, terrified Clark. She was someone else entirely. She expertly pulled the heavy magazine, the motion fluid, and practiced. She tilted the rifle, her head cocked at a precise angle, and peered into the open action. Her eyes, narrowed and focused, took in the scene with a surgeon's diagnostic gaze. She didn't yank at the charging handle or bang on the receiver, as Jensen had. Instead, she gently probed the ejection port with the tip of her index finger, her touch delicate, almost reverent. In less than 5 seconds, she had the answer. It was a classic double feed, a messy and stubborn jam where 2 cartridges tried to enter the chamber at once. But this was worse. The fine, almost microscopic desert sand, carried on the wind, had worked its way deep into the mechanism, mixing with the lubricant to create a gritty, abrasive paste that had seized the bolt carrier group with unyielding tenacity. Private Garcia, a young soldier with wide, frightened eyes, watched her from a few feet away. "What the hell is she doing?" he whispered to the man next to him, his voice tight with disbelief. "She's going to lose a finger." Lara ignored him. Her focus was absolute. She reached into a small, unassuming pocket on the thigh of her fatigues, a pocket the other soldiers used for spare batteries or chewing tobacco. Her fingers, however, emerged with a small, worn leather pouch, its surface softened and darkened with age. She unrolled it on her knee, revealing a set of specialized tools that looked utterly out of place in this maelstrom of destruction. It was a compact, custom gunsmith's kit. The other soldiers might have expected her to produce a Leatherman, to apply brute force. Instead, she performed what could only be described as surgery. She selected a small, sharp pick from the kit and, with a watchmaker's precision, carefully angled it into the action. She found the rim of the first wedged cartridge and, with a gentle, practiced nudge, dislodged it. It fell free with a quiet rattle. The second cartridge was more deeply embedded, its brass casing deformed by the pressure of the seized bolt. Lara set aside the pick and took up a pair of slender needle-nosed pliers. She gripped the rim of the stuck cartridge, her knuckles white, not from force, but from the sheer precision of her grip. She didn't pull. She applied a specific, calculated torque, a subtle twist of her wrist that used the geometry of the chamber itself as a fulcrum. There was a faint, grating sound, and then the mangled brass slid free. With the obstruction cleared, she took a small, stiff, bristled brush and a tiny can of compressed air from the kit. Meticulously, she cleaned the sand and grime from the bolt carrier group, the chamber, and the feed ramp, her movements economical, fluid, and eerily silent. The entire operation took less than a minute. As she worked, the storm, as if angered by her defiance, intensified into a roaring gale. The sky, already a murky brown, darkened to a sickly, bruised orange. Visibility, which had been poor, dropped to almost nothing. The world beyond 50 meters ceased to exist, swallowed by a swirling, impenetrable wall of sand. The enemy's fire became more sporadic, their gunners now as blind as the soldiers of Alpha Company, but the bullets that did find their way through the gale were no less deadly for their randomness. The platoon's high-tech optics, their expensive digital eyes on the world, were now worse than useless. Their screens showed nothing but a blizzard of swirling static, a digital representation of their own blindness. They were completely, utterly cut off. A new and more profound sense of dread began to settle over the men. They were trapped, wounded, and unable to see their attackers. The brief, confusing flicker of hope they had felt watching Lara work on the rifle was extinguished by the storm. Now, they were just waiting for the inevitable, for the enemy to walk their mortar fire into the wreckage or to charge them out of the blinding sand. Lara finished cleaning the rifle. She inserted the magazine, not tentatively, but with a firm, confident motion that ended in a solid, authoritative Times, thwack asterisk. The sound cut through the howl of the wind, a note of pure mechanical certainty in a world of chaos. She cycled the action. The bolt slid forward like silk on glass, chambering around with a whisper. Smooth click. The rifle was alive again. She looked up, her gaze directed towards the ridge where the enemy was hidden, a ridge that was now completely invisible, lost in the churning brown apocalypse, but she didn't need to see it. Another memory surfaced, unbidden. She was a teenager, maybe 16, standing on a vast windswept prairie in Montana with her father. The wind was a living thing out there, a constant, powerful presence that flattened the grass and sculpted the clouds. There were no fancy gadgets, no digital wind meters or ballistic computers. He was teaching her to read the wind itself. "Forget the Kestrel," he had said, gesturing dismissively towards the expensive piece of equipment another shooter was using down the line. "That's a crutch. It tells you the wind speed where you are. The bullet doesn't stay where you are. It travels through 1,000 different currents between here and there. You have to learn its language." He had made her stand for hours, just feeling the pressure of the wind on her cheek, watching how the tall grass bent and swayed in intricate flowing patterns. "Listen," he'd urged her. "Listen to the sound it makes whistling past your ears. Is it a high, thin hiss or a low, deep moan? The wind tells you a story about what it's doing now and what it's going to do next. You just have to learn to listen." Lara ignored the multi-$1,000 sand, blinded scope attached to the rifle. Its advanced electronics were useless. She licked her index finger and held it up, feeling the familiar pressure of the grit, laden wind pushing against her skin. She closed her eyes, her face becoming a mask of pure, unadulterated concentration. The sounds of the storm, the distant, sporadic gunfire, the worried breathing of the lieutenant beside her, it all faded away. In the quiet, focused theater of her mind, a complex, multi-variable ballistic equation was being solved, not with numbers on a screen, but with a lifetime of ingrained intuitive knowledge. Windage, elevation, spin drift, barometric pressure, humidity, even the subtle, almost imperceptible rotation of the Earth, the Coriolis effect, it was all there. She was a living, breathing ballistic computer, processing sensory input that the Platoon's technology could no longer even detect. Her hands moved to the scope's external turrets. The clicks of her adjustments were sharp, crisp, and precise in the roaring wind. Click, click, click. She wasn't guessing. She was calculating. Lieutenant Reyes, his face etched with a mixture of desperation and utter confusion, crawled over to her. The sand whipped around them, stinging any exposed skin. "Briggs, what in God's name are you doing?" he shouted, his voice tight with urgency. "You can't see anything. Get your head down before you lose it." Lara didn't seem to hear the urgency in his voice. She didn't even look at him. Her eyes were still closed, but her head was tilted as if listening to a distant song. Her own voice, when it came, was calm, distant, almost detached from the chaos around them. "Hold for 63 MOA elevation," she said, the words clear and precise despite the gale. "Wind is 20 miles per hour, full value. Adjusting for a left, 2, right, push." Reyes stared at her, completely and utterly dumbfounded. She was speaking a language he had only ever heard in sterile classrooms, a theoretical language of ballistics that seemed to have no place in this gritty life or death struggle. He was about to grab her, to physically pull her down, to order her to stop this insane, suicidal fantasy. But then he saw the look on her face. It wasn't the look of a panicked clerk. It wasn't the look of a soldier who had snapped under pressure. It was the look of a master craftsman, a virtuoso, poised to perform her life's work. He hesitated, his hand hovering in the air, caught between a career of following regulations and the undeniable, terrifying certainty in her voice. In that moment of hesitation, the fate of Alpha Company hung in the balance. Lara settled into a prone position behind the rifle, the heavy weapon feeling not like a burden, but like an extension of her own body, a familiar weight she had carried in her soul for years. The rough, gritty texture of the sand against her fatigues, the solid stock pressed into the hollow of her shoulder, it all felt right. She couldn't see the enemy sniper nest, not with her eyes. The world was a roaring, opaque curtain of brown. But she didn't need to. Before the storm had reached its blinding peak, she had taken a snapshot, a perfect, high, resolution picture stored in the vaults of her memory. She saw the distinctive, jagged rock formation on the ridge, a shape like a broken tooth. She saw the small, dark shadow in a crevice just to its left, the place where the muzzle flash had blinked. She had it. The coordinates were locked in her mind. She visualized the journey of the bullet, a graceful, invisible arc curving through the roaring, chaotic wind. It was a pure, elegant line of physics cutting through the storm. In her mind's eye, she pictured the enemy sniper, comfortable and arrogant in his concealment, believing himself utterly invisible, completely safe. He was a variable in an equation, a problem set at a great distance. A cold, detached certainty settled over her, a feeling her father had called the knowing. This was not an act of anger, not a moment of fear, fueled revenge. It was the final, definitive step in solving a complex mathematical problem. The question had been asked by the enemy's aggression, and the answer was a 338 caliber piece of lead, delivered with absolute precision. Her breathing slowed, each inhalation and exhalation a conscious, deliberate act. She felt her heart rate descend from a frantic hammering to a slow, steady drumbeat against her ribs. In, out, in, out. The world, with all its noise and terror, shrank to the tiny, focused space between her eye and the useless scope, the feel of the cold, curved trigger against the pad of her index finger. She wasn't waiting for a visual cue. She was waiting for a feeling, a fractional lull in the wind's oppressive force, a subtle shift in the pressure against her face that she could feel but no one could see. It came, a momentary easing, a split-second breath taken by the storm itself. Her finger tightened, applying smooth, steady pressure. The rifle barked, a single, sharp crack that was almost swallowed by the gale, a sound more felt than heard. The recoil was a familiar, comforting punch against her shoulder, a violent but predictable friend. The action was a blur of practiced motion, her right hand instinctively working the bolt, ejecting the spent casing and chambering a new round before the echo of the first shot had fully dissipated. Her eyes, though seeing nothing but sand, were already scanning, her mind already moving to the next target, her movements economical and utterly devoid of hesitation. For a long, pregnant moment, there was nothing but the ceaseless howl of the wind. The soldiers of Alpha Company, huddled behind their ruined vehicle, held their breath. Then, the realization dawned on them, slowly at first, then with a rush of impossible hope. The sharp, supersonic crack of the enemy sniper rounds, the sound that had been tearing at their nerves and chewing up their cover, had stopped. The oppressive, lethal threat that had them pinned down like insects had simply vanished into the storm. Private Garcia, the young soldier who had been so certain she would lose a finger, inched his head up, peering through his own rifle's scope, which showed him nothing but the same swirling brown mess as everyone else's. He lowered it, his face a mask of confusion and dawning awe. Did you hit something?" he stammered, his voice a mixture of desperate hope and utter disbelief, directed at the still, prone form of the supply clerk. "Is he gone?" Lara's voice, when it came, was quiet, almost a whisper against the wind, her focus already elsewhere. "He's gone." She didn't acknowledge the stunned, uncomprehending looks from the others. Her work wasn't finished. During the initial, chaotic moments of the ambush, her mind, trained for observation and analysis, had pinpointed not just the sniper, but the location of a heavy machine gun that was methodically tearing their MRAP apart. It was further down the ridge, a more difficult position, partially protected by a rocky outcrop that would shield it from a direct line of sight from below. Her hands moved with a serene and terrible purpose. Her left hand, deft and certain, dialed the elevation turret on the scope. Click, click, click. The sharp, mechanical sounds were a counterpoint to the organic roar of the storm. Her right hand made a more subtle adjustment for windage. A new calculation, a new problem set. The distance was different, the angle more severe. The wind would affect the bullet differently over this longer path. In the cold, silent calculus of her mind, she had to account for the bullet's transition through the transonic phase of its flight, the unstable moment where it drops below the speed of sound, a variable that could send a shot wildly off course. It was a calculation that gave even the most experienced shooters fits. For Lara, it was just another line in the equation. Again, she waited. She was not a passive observer, but an active participant in the storm. She felt for its rhythm, for the invisible currents and eddies in the air. She was a part of the chaos, and she understood its language. She found her moment, another fractional pause in the gale's fury, and she fired. The second shot was a near-perfect echo of the first, a single, sharp report that punched through the wind and vanished. The heavy, thumping chatter of the enemy machine gun, which had been firing in sporadic, searching bursts, ceased. It didn't just stop. It was cut off mid-burst, a sentence left unfinished. An eerie, profound silence descended upon the battlefield, a quiet so deep and absolute that it was more shocking than the noise had been. The only sound left was the lonely, mournful cry of the wind whistling over the wreckage. The entire platoon held its breath, every man listening, waiting for the familiar, terrifying sound of enemy fire to resume. Nothing. The silence stretched, thick and heavy with unspoken questions. As if on cue, as if the world itself was waiting for the outcome of her actions, the sandstorm began to abate. The thickest part of the storm passed over them, and the churning wall of brown began to thin. Visibility slowly, grudgingly, improved, from 50 meters to 100, then to 500. The distant ridge began to emerge from the haze, a faint, ghostly silhouette against the bruised sky. Sergeant Cole, the platoon's designated marksman, and a man who prided himself on his technical expertise, had been desperately trying to get a reading with his high-powered laser rangefinder. He had been aiming at the spots where he thought the enemy was, but the thick dust and sand had scattered the laser, giving him nothing but error messages. Now, through a thinning patch of haze, he got a brief, flickering return from the area of the sniper's nest on the ridge. He stared at the number that appeared on the small digital display. He shook his head, muttering under his breath, assuming it was a malfunction caused by the atmospheric conditions. The number was absurd. He took another reading, this time aiming for the second enemy position, the machine gun nest further down the ridge. The laser found its mark. The number that flashed on his screen was almost identical to the first. Cole looked from the glowing red digits on his rangefinder to the impossibly distant ridge, which was now becoming clearer by the second. Then his gaze fell upon the quiet, unassuming woman who was now calmly clearing the rifle, her movements as placid and methodical as if she were tidying her desk back at the depot. He keyed his calm, his voice cracking with a mixture of awe and pure, unadulterated shock that cut through the radio static, a voice that every man in the platoon would remember for the rest of their lives. "Lieutenant," he stammered, his voice barely a whisper at first, then rising in volume as the reality of what he was seeing settled in. "Lieutenant, you are not going to believe this. I have a confirmed range on those targets." "Holy, that's a 3,300-meter hit. Sir, that's over 2 miles. That's impossible." The remaining soldiers of Alpha Company, scattered and bleeding behind the smoking ruin of their vehicle, stared at Lara. The wind, though lessening, still whipped dust and debris around them, but it felt as if they were all in the eye of the storm, in a pocket of profound and unnerving silence. The woman they knew as a quiet, efficient supply clerk, a creature of spreadsheets and inventory lists, was sitting calmly amidst the carnage. A long, dark smudge of dirt and grease stained one cheek, and her hair was a wild, tangled mess, but her expression was one of serene focus. She was wiping down the M2010 with a soft cloth from her kit, her hands moving with a practiced, methodical grace that was utterly at odds with the violent miracle she had just performed. The contrast was jarring, almost terrifying. They looked at each other, the hardened combat soldiers, their faces a raw mixture of shock, profound relief, and a dawning, humbling respect. They had been saved, pulled from the brink of annihilation by the very last person they ever would have expected. In that moment, the rigid, unspoken caste system of the army, the one that cleanly separated the fighters from the supporters, the door kickers from the bean counters, was not just broken, it was obliterated, turned to dust and scattered on the desert wind. They were all just soldiers, and the one who had saved them was the one they had dismissed. Lieutenant Reyes slowly, stiffly, got to his feet. He held his own rifle loosely at his side, the weapon suddenly feeling like a clumsy toy. He walked over to Lara, his boots crunching on shattered glass and spent casings. He crouched down beside her, his face a mask of confusion and a deep, soul-shaking awe. He had to raise his voice slightly to be heard over the receding wind. "Briggs," he began, the name feeling inadequate. "Staff Sergeant, I don't even know what to ask. I don't know what I just saw. How did you do that? Who are you?" Lara looked up from the rifle, her eyes, clear and calm, meeting his. There was no triumph in them, no excitement, only a deep, quiet weariness. Her voice was soft, almost lost in the wind. "My dad was a shooter, sir. He taught me a few things." The sheer, breathtaking understatement of her reply left Reyes utterly speechless. A few things. She had just performed an act that would be considered impossible by the world's most elite marksman, under conditions that defied all logic and training, and she called it a few things. He simply stared at her, then gave a slow, single nod, unable to formulate another question, unable to do anything but accept the simple, impossible truth of what he had witnessed. With the immediate threats neutralized, Reyes knew they had to secure the ridge. He gathered a small fire team, their movements still hesitant, their eyes constantly flicking back towards Lara as if she might vanish. The climb was arduous, a grueling scramble up loose rock and shifting sand. With every foot of elevation they gained, the scale of what had happened became more terrifyingly clear. When they finally crested the ridge, they found the two enemy combatants exactly where Lara's shots had promised they would be. The sniper was slumped over his rifle, a single, precise hole drilled through his optics and the man behind them. The machine gunner lay a short distance away, his weapon silenced, his body neutralized with the same surgical precision. The wind was stronger up here, a constant, powerful force that made them lean into it. They looked back towards the convoy's wreckage. From this vantage point, their comrades were tiny, insignificant specks in the vast, empty expanse of the desert, the massive MRAP no bigger than a child's toy. It seemed impossible that a bullet could have traveled so far, through such a storm, and found its mark not once, but twice. It was a miracle, a terrifying, beautiful, and undeniable miracle. Back at Forward Operating Base Phoenix, the story spread faster than a desert fire. The soldiers of Alpha Company, once they were safely back inside the wire, recounted the events to anyone who would listen. With each telling, the story grew, taking on the burnished, fantastical glow of legend. In the mess hall, in the gym, in the smoky haze of the barracks late at night, a montage of overlapping whispers created a new reality. They say she built the rifle from spare parts in the middle of the firefight. Nah, man, I heard she shot it from the hip, both eyes closed, just listening to the wind. My buddy in Signals said she predicted the sandstorm down to the minute and used it for cover, like some kind of desert witch. They're calling her the Ghost of Phoenix. Lara tried to return to her duties, to the quiet, orderly sanctuary of the supply depot. She craved the simple, logical comfort of her manifests and requisitions, but her sanctuary had been invaded. She was now the subject of constant, unending scrutiny. Soldiers she had never met would stop and stare as she walked past, their expressions a mixture of awe and disbelief. Some would give her a wide-eyed nod of profound respect. Sergeant Petrov, the grizzled quartermaster who had once scoffed at her, saw her crossing the compound. He stopped, his mouth hanging slightly open. He watched her walk away, then just shook his head slowly, a look of grudging, absolute awe etched on his greasy face. Lieutenant Reyes sat in his makeshift office, a cramped plywood box that smelled of stale coffee and dust. He stared at the blank. After action report on his laptop screen, the cursor blinking mockingly at him. He had been trying to write it for an hour, but the words wouldn't come. How do you write a report about a miracle? How do you describe the impossible in the dry, factual language of a military document? His mind raced, trying to formulate the sentences. Asterisk Staff Sergeant Briggs, S. 4, with no combat MOS or advanced marksmanship qualifications, neutralized 2 enemy combatants at a range of approximately 3,300 meters. This was accomplished using a field-repaired M2010 sniper rifle during a sandstorm that rendered all advanced optics and laser range-finding equipment ineffective. Asterisk. It read like a tall tale, like something out of a comic book. It was the truth, but it was a truth no one in a position of authority would ever believe. His company commander, Captain Wallace, entered the office, letting the makeshift door slam shut behind him. Reyes, I've read Sergeant Cole's preliminary report, and I've talked to half a dozen of your men. They're all telling the same story. He paused, his eyes boring into the young lieutenant. Are you telling me this is accurate? Reyes looked up from his screen, his eyes tired but his voice firm. Sir, I was there. I saw it. I don't understand it, but I saw it. Captain Wallace summoned Lara to his office. He was a man who believed in order, in regulations, in the neat, predictable boxes that the army used to categorize its soldiers. He looked at her service record on his screen, a glowing testament to a phenomenal logistician. Then he looked at her, standing before his desk, her uniform immaculate, her posture perfect. The two things, the record and the woman, the legend and the reality, did not align. Lara Briggs was an anomaly, a glitch in the system that broke all the rules. Staff Sergeant, Wallace began, his tone carefully neutral. What you did out there was extraordinary, to say the least. The story has already started moving up the chain of command, and they want to capitalize on it. He leaned forward, folding his hands on the desk. They've authorized a direct transfer for you to the Scout Sniper program. A fast-track promotion to Sergeant First Class is on the table. It's a career-making opportunity." Lara's expression didn't change. Her voice, when she spoke, was firm but respectful, without a hint of arrogance or false modesty. "With all due respect, sir, I must decline." Wallace blinked. He was genuinely baffled. "Decline? Staff Sergeant, do you understand what's being offered here? This is what soldiers dream of." "That's not who I am, sir," Lara said simply. "I'm a logistician. I make sure the right gear gets to the right people at the right time. I solve problems with a keyboard and a manifest. That's my job. That's where I belong." The captain was left staring at her, more confused than ever. He had a soldier who could apparently perform miracles on the battlefield, a weapon the army would kill to have in its arsenal, and all she wanted to do was go back to counting inventory. He didn't know whether to be frustrated, angry, or profoundly impressed. He was a man who had a box for everything, and he had just found something that would never, ever fit. The story of the 2-mile shot had grown wings. It flew from the dusty confines of Fob Phoenix, across the theater of operations, and all the way back to the polished corridors of the Pentagon. A story that fantastic, that unbelievable, could not be allowed to simply exist as a legend. It had to be either verified and weaponized or debunked and buried. The bureaucracy, a machine far more powerful and relentless than any enemy machine gun, began to grind. A C-130 Hercules, a lumbering gray beast, landed on the FOB's airstrip, its arrival a blunt and unwelcome intrusion into the base's established rhythm. From its ramp emerged a team of men who looked distinctly out of place. They were investigators, a joint team from the Criminal Investigation Division and the Army Marksmanship Unit, and they walked with an air of crisp, sterile authority. They were led by Major Hendricks, a man whose posture was so ramrod, straight it seemed painful, and whose face was set in a perpetual look of cynical disbelief. He didn't see a war zone. He saw a crime scene, a place where the neat, orderly laws of physics and military protocol had allegedly been violated. Their mission, on paper, was to verify the alleged incident. Their demeanor, however, suggested they were here to put a stop to a fairy tale. Lara found herself seated in a sterile, windowless room, a temporary interrogation space that had been cleared out for the investigators. The air was cold, recycled, and smelled faintly of bleach. Major Hendricks sat opposite her at a folding table, a thick file laid squarely between them. He didn't see a hero, he didn't see a soldier. He saw a loose thread, a statistical anomaly that threatened the neat tapestry of military order he had dedicated his life to upholding. He opened the file, his movements precise and economical. "Staff Sergeant Briggs," he began, his voice as cold and flat as the tabletop. "Your file is interesting. In fact, it's exemplary. You're a phenomenal logistician, top of your class in advanced individual training. You have commendations for streamlining supply chains that saved the Army millions of dollars. You are, by all accounts, a model soldier in your chosen field." He paused, letting the praise hang in the air for a moment before turning it into a weapon. "And yet, I have your records from basic training. At the rifle range, you qualified. Barely. You shot the absolute minimum score required to pass. 30, 2 out of 40. Explain that discrepancy for me." Lara's hands were folded neatly in her lap. "I'm not a marksman, sir. I'm a supply specialist." Hendricks leaned forward, his eyes narrowing into icy slits. His voice dropped, losing its official flatness and taking on a sharp, dangerous edge. "Don't play games with me, Staff Sergeant. People don't go from being a barely qualified shot to making a 3,000-plus meter kill in the middle of a sandstorm. It is not possible. It violates every known principle of ballistics, training, and common sense. So, either you are lying, or Lieutenant Reyes and his entire platoon are lying. Which is it?" The Major's aggressive questioning was a wall, pushing her back, forcing her towards a door she had locked and bolted more than a decade ago. She had run from that room, from that life, and now, in this sterile box thousands of miles from home, a man in a crisp uniform was demanding the key. She took a slow breath, the recycled air feeling thin in her lungs. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was low and steady, the sound of a lock turning. "My father," she began, "was Mark Briggs." She saw a flicker of recognition in Hendricks's eyes. The name still carried weight in certain circles. She continued, the words coming slowly at first, then with a gathering momentum, like an avalanche, starting with a single stone. She described her childhood, not in a home, but in a laboratory dedicated to the singular pursuit of ballistic perfection. Her father hadn't been just a shooter, he was a savant, a legend in the cloistered, obsessive world of long-range precision shooting and custom gunsmithing. Her lullabies weren't songs. They were the sounds of a lathe turning a rifle barrel to within a 10,000th of an inch of tolerance. Her bedtime stories were chapters from ballistics manuals, her father's voice rumbling about drag coefficients and muzzle velocity. She explained that she could calculate wind drift in her head before she could do long division in school. By the age of 10, she could strip and reassemble a Remington 700 blindfolded, her small hands moving with an instinctive, fluid grace. Her father hadn't taught her to be a soldier. He had taught her to be an extension of the rifle, a living, breathing, ballistic computer. Her voice became strained, the memories tinged with a darkness she had tried so hard to forget. She explained the other side of her father's obsession. It was a jealous god, demanding all his time, all his focus, all his passion. It consumed him, drove her mother away, and built a wall of science and steel around their lives, isolating them from the world. He saw everything as a variable to be controlled, a problem to be solved, including her. Her childhood was a series of endless, grueling tests, not of her character, but of her ability to perform. He died in his workshop, Lara said, her voice barely a whisper. A reloading accident. He was working on a new Wildcat cartridge, trying to create the perfect load, something that would defy gravity itself. He was so focused on the theory, on the numbers, that he missed a critical flaw in the brass, a microscopic fracture. He was alone. She looked directly at Hendricks, her eyes holding a universe of pain and resolve. I joined the army to get away from that world. I wanted a life that was the exact opposite of his. Logistics, it's predictable. It's about rules and order and making sure things add up. It's safe. The numbers on a manifest don't lie, and they don't explode in your face. Hendricks listened, his expression unreadable. So you're telling me you possess this extraordinary, perhaps singular skill, a skill the military would kill for, and you chose to hide it so you could count widgets instead? I didn't hide it, sir. Lara corrected him, her voice firm again. I ran from it. The major sat back, his face a mask of stone. A compelling story, Staff Sergeant. A very dramatic and convenient narrative. But I deal in facts, not feelings. He stood up. And the only fact I have is an impossible claim, so we're going to get some facts. He arranged a demonstration at the FOB's long-range facility. The M2010, now repaired, cleaned, and dubbed the Ghost by the base armorers, was brought out and placed on a shooting mat. A standard silhouette target was placed on a distant hill. A laser rangefinder confirmed the distance, 3,300 meters. The entire investigative team was there, their notebooks and cameras ready. Captain Wallace and Lieutenant Reyes were there too, standing off to the side, their faces tight with anxiety. The pressure was immense, a physical weight in the air. The conditions were perfect, a shooter's dream. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue. The air was clear and calm, with no wind to read, no chaos to focus her mind. There was only the silence, and the heavy, crushing weight of expectation. Lara lay behind the rifle. It felt cold and alien in her hands. In the storm, it had been an extension of her body, a part of her. Now, it was a heavy, judgmental weight, a tool she no longer knew how to use. She tried to control her breathing, to slow her heart rate as her father had taught her, but she could feel dozens of pairs of eyes on her back. She could feel their doubt, their hope, their curiosity. She tried to find the focus, the quiet place in her mind where the calculations happened, but it was gone. There was no storm to interpret, no story to read in the wind. There was only a target, a rifle, and failure. She closed her eyes, took a breath, and fired. The shot was loud in the still air. Through the high-powered spotting scope, one of Hendricks's men called out the result. A miss, wide by at least 20 meters. She cycled the bolt, her movements feeling clumsy and foreign. She tried to adjust, to remember the feeling, but there was nothing there. She fired again. Another miss, this one even wider. Major Hendricks let out a small, satisfied smirk. It was a tiny, almost imperceptible expression, but to Lara, it was as loud as a gunshot. Just as I thought, he said, his voice carrying easily in the quiet. He turned to his team, already dictating the conclusion of his report, his voice filled with the smug satisfaction of a man whose cynicism has been vindicated. A 1 in a billion lucky shot, amplified by the chaos of battle and a convenient sandstorm that obscured any real evidence. A fluke, nothing more. He turned and walked away, his team packing up their equipment. The case officially closed. Lara remained on the ground, the smell of gunpowder filling her nostrils, The scent that had once been her comfort, now the smell of her humiliation. She felt a crushing wave of self-doubt wash over her, cold and suffocating. Hendrix's words echoed in her mind, over and over. Asterisk, a fluke, a fluke, a fluke. Asterisk, was he right? Was that all it was? A random confluence of wind and luck and desperation? Had she not been a master of the storm, but just its fool? Lara was devastated. The official report, a cold, sterile document that would become the final word on the matter, dismissed the incident as a statistically improbable but ultimately lucky shot. A fluke. The word echoed in the hollow spaces of her mind, a venomous whisper that poisoned her confidence and made a mockery of her father's legacy. She felt like a fraud, a charlatan who had accidentally stumbled into a miracle and was now being exposed under the harsh, unforgiving lights of scrutiny. She retreated to the one place in the world where she felt in control. Her supply depot, the neat rows of shelves, the predictable logic of the inventory system, the quiet hum of the climate control. This was her fortress. She threw herself into her work with a desperate, manic energy, working 18-hour days, losing herself in the black and white certainty of manifests and shipping labels. She was trying to rebuild the orderly walls around her life, the ones the firefight and its impossible aftermath had shattered. She was trying to bury the ghost of the gunsmith's daughter under a mountain of paperwork. Lieutenant Reyes found her late one night, long after the base had settled into a quiet rhythm. The only light in the vast depot came from the green glow of her computer monitor, casting long, distorted shadows that made the shelves of supplies look like silent, judging giants. She had fallen asleep at her desk, her head resting on a pile of printed requisitions, her cheek smudged with ink. He stood there for a long moment, watching the slow, steady rise and fall of her shoulders. He quietly approached and gently touched her arm. Lara jolted awake, her eyes wide and disoriented for a second, before the familiar weight of her failure settled back onto her. Reyes didn't say anything about the investigation or Major Hendrix. He didn't offer platitudes or try to argue with the official report. He simply looked at her, his eyes filled with a quiet, unwavering sincerity. "We don't care what some major from stateside thinks," he said, his voice low and steady. "We were there. We know what you did." He reached into his pocket and placed a small, crudely carved object on her desk. It rested on the ink-stained paperwork, a piece of rustic warmth in a world of sterile data. It was a wooden replica of a 338 Lapua Magnum cartridge, the same type of round used in the M2010. It was uneven in places, the lines not perfectly straight, but it had been whittled with obvious care and attention. "Garcia made this for you," Reyes continued, a faint smile touching his lips. "He's gotten into whittling. Says it calms his nerves. It's not much, but we all owe you our lives, Briggs. Never forget that." Lara stared at the small wooden bullet. She picked it up. It was warm and smooth in her hand, the grain of the wood a tangible connection to the young soldier who had made it. This simple, heartfelt gesture, this clumsy piece of wood, meant more to her than any official commendation or medal ever could. It was not a symbol of an impossible achievement. It was a symbol of their faith in her. It was a tangible piece of their gratitude. And as she closed her hand around it, she felt a small, defiant ember of her own self. Belief begin to glow in the cold darkness of her doubt. The radio in the depot, usually silent save for routine status checks, crackled to life with a sudden, frantic urgency. The voice was panicked, breaking with static and fear. It was a voice from Reyes' platoon. Another convoy, this one carrying critical medical supplies for a forward aid station, had been ambushed in the same sector, in the same cursed stretch of desert. The enemy was back, and this time they were better prepared. The frantic calls painted a grim picture. The enemy was using advanced thermal optics, their ghostly white-hot signatures allowing them to see through the dust of another rising sandstorm. Alpha Company was pinned down, taking casualties, and their own optics were failing again in the swirling grit. History was repeating itself, but this time, the enemy had an advantage. This time, the storm was not a shield for the platoon. It was a hunting ground for the enemy. Lara stood frozen, listening to the desperate calls, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She could hear Reyes' voice now, calm and commanding, but strained, trying to rally his men against an enemy they couldn't see. She looked at the requisitions on her desk, the neat columns of numbers and codes that represented the safe, orderly life she had so desperately chosen. It was a life of predictable problems and logical solutions. Then she thought of Reyes and Garcia and the other men of Alpha Company, their faces etched in her memory. She felt the smooth, warm shape of the small wooden bullet still clutched in her hand. It was a choice, a crossroads, the path of the logistician or the path of the gunsmith's daughter. She made a choice. The hesitation, the fear, the doubt, it all burned away in a sudden, clarifying fire. She stood up, her chair scraping loudly in the quiet depot. She walked out of her sanctuary of order and strode with a singular, unwavering purpose directly to the base armory. The armorer, a grizzled sergeant first class, who had heard all the rumors and had seen the official report, looked up as she entered. He saw the look in her eyes and knew this was not a request. Lara requisitioned the ghost. The armorer simply nodded and handed the heavy rifle case over without a single question. From there, she went to the flight line, the rifle case held firmly in her hand. She found a helicopter pilot, a young warrant officer about to shut down his Black Hawk for the night. "I need a ride," she said, her voice calm, clear, and leaving no room for argument. "Get me to the edge of the Kilo, 7 engagement zone." Now, the helicopter bucked and swayed, fighting the turbulent winds on the edge of the storm. The pilot dropped her a few kilometers from the firefight. The sound of distant, automatic weapons fire carried on the howling wind. As soon as her boots hit the ground, she scrambled up a high, rocky outcrop, the heavy rifle case feeling like a natural part of her. The position gave her a commanding view of the valley below, a swirling cauldron of sand and smoke. The conditions were almost identical to the first time. The roaring wind, the blinding, stinging sand, but this time there was no fear. There was no hesitation. This was not a place of terror, it was her element. This was her father's workshop, on a grand and deadly scale. She didn't wait to be asked. She didn't wait for permission. She settled behind the rifle, her movements fluid and certain. A dance she had known her entire life. She felt the wind, not as an obstacle, but as a partner. She read its story in the pressure on her skin and the sound in her ears. She calculated the shot, her mind a silent, perfect computer. She fired. In the valley below, a distant enemy technical, a pickup truck armed with a heavy machine gun that had been chewing away at the platoon's position, erupted in a brilliant, silent ball of fire. She didn't pause to admire her work. She cycled the bolt, her eyes already scanning the battlefield through the storm. Through the haze, she saw what the enemy saw, a world of heat signatures. She saw the 2-man sniper team, their bodies glowing white against the cooler background, revealed by the very thermal optics that had given them their advantage. She adjusted her aim. A new calculation, a new answer. She fired again. The 2 glowing signatures on the ridge went dark, their position instantly silenced. She had done it again. This time, however, she was not the only one watching. High above the storm, in the calm, clear air of the stratosphere, a high-altitude surveillance drone, diverted to the area by a quick-thinking command officer who had heard the radio traffic, recorded the entire event in stunning, undeniable thermal detail. There was no room for doubt. There was no room for luck. There was only the footage. The drone footage was irrefutable. It was cold, hard, digital proof of the impossible. Major Hendricks was quietly, unceremoniously recalled, his report buried in a file that would never be seen again. Captain Wallace summoned Lara to his office for a second time. This time, as she stood before his desk, his expression was not one of confusion. It was one of pure, unadulterated, slack-jawed awe. "Briggs," he said, his voice hushed, "I don't have a box to put you in. The Army doesn't have a box for what you can do. So, I'm creating a new one." He didn't offer her a sniper role. He didn't offer her a path to the front lines. He understood, finally, that was not what she wanted. Instead, he offered her something unique, something that had never existed before. A new position was being created, just for her. Special consultant for unconventional ballistics and extreme environment marksmanship. She would not be a trigger, puller. She would be a teacher, a scientist, a force multiplier. She would analyze atmospheric data, develop new training doctrines for shooting in impossible conditions, and advise the Army's most elite special operations units. "You can use your father's gift," Wallace said, his voice filled with a newfound respect, "but you can do it on your own terms. You can build something new from it, something that saves lives, not just one at a time, but by the hundreds, by changing how we think, how we fight. What do you say?" The final scene is not in an office or a supply depot. It is on a windy, desolate range high in the mountains. Lara is not a student being tested, but a teacher. A group of elite scout snipers, the best of the best, are gathered around her, their multi-$1,000 rifles and advanced electronics lying forgotten on their shooting mats. They are listening to her, their expressions intent, their focus absolute. Lara isn't holding a rifle. She has her hand held out, her eyes closed, Her face turned towards the wind. "Forget your instruments for a minute," she says, her voice calm and clear, easily carrying over the wind. "They can lie, they can break. Close your eyes. Feel the pressure on your face. Listen to the sound it makes. What is the wind telling you?" She opens her eyes and smiles, a genuine, peaceful smile that reaches all the way to her eyes. She has finally found a way to reconcile the two halves of her life, the gunsmith's daughter and the logistics officer. She has embraced her father's legacy without being consumed by it, forging her own unique path, a path of order and chaos, of science and instinct. The ghost of the past was no longer a burden to be run from, but a quiet, knowing guide, whispering its secrets on the wind.